I'm here in Leipzig. Leipzig? Was there a battle here in World War II? Yes, the Battle of Leipzig of 1945, a forgotten World War II battle. Stay tuned. We're in the last months of the Second World War. The Allies had poured into Germany, and when they crossed the Rhine River, the end of March 1945, there were no natural barriers for them anymore. Also, the German armies across the river consisted of 60 divisions on paper, but in reality they proved just half as strong. Many Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered as soon as the Western Allies appeared. SS units, they fought on more fanatical, but they were hindered by the lack of supplies. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was as good as dead. There was a lack of fuel, lack of planes, and German airfields had been bombed systematically. In the north, the armies of Montgomery crossed the Rhine at Wesel. In the middle, at Remagen, the troops led by Omar Bradley pushed towards the east. One army was sent south towards the Alpine fortress, where according to speculative intelligence Hitler would be located at. This wasn't the case because Hitler was in Berlin. The French poured into the south of Germany as well. At the end of March, the Allies captured Frankfurt, and they also liberated concentration camps. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany, wasn't attacked directly but surrounded, and the German Army Group B, led by Field Marshal Walter Model, got encircled early April. Mid-April, the pocket surrendered. Around that time, the Americans reached Magdeburg and crossed the Elbe River. Berlin was for the Soviets to take. Eisenhower later admitted he found the price of an estimated 100,000 American lives far too high for just a prestige object that would be turned over to the Soviets anyway. The Allies were aiming their arrows at Leipzig, located in Saxony. Leipzig had been bombed several times during the war, and the recent bombing had occurred in February 1945, which left large parts of the city center in ruins. As the Americans came closer to the Saale River, they were taken under fire by German anti-aircraft guns, so-called flak guns. There were several rings of these guns around the city of Leipzig. Now, not necessarily to defend the city itself, but more the synthetic oil refineries. According to the American intelligence, there were located 374 guns around the city, and these weren't used to fire at incoming planes, but at the American armored units. What made it so troublesome was that the terrain around the city was very flat, so this was an ideal range for the German guns. Allied airmen, they referred to the area as Flak Alley. The Allied infantry, however, wasn't notified about this. On April 15th, the Americans broke to the first ring of flak guns. On April 16th, Colditz Castle was liberated, and this was a German POW camp for Allied personnel. Around 1,800 Allied officers were liberated. On April 18th, Leipzig was cut off, and in the meanwhile, the Americans crossed the Saale River and occupied several small towns and villages. Leipzig was Germany's fifth largest city with 750,000 inhabitants. German Colonel Hans von Poncet commanded the German defenders in Leipzig, which included troops of the 14th Flak Division, some of who had lost their anti-aircraft weapons and were now serving as infantry, 750 men of the 107th Motorized Infantry Regiment, a motorized battalion of about 250 soldiers, some Hitler Youth members, and several battalions of the Volkssturm, which was this last-ditch army of the Third Reich, consisted of old men and young boys. Furthermore, Leipzig was protected by its police force, 3,400 men strong. But these were not under Poncet's control. No, they were under command by Brigadier General of the Police, Wilhelm von Grolmann. Now these two men, they got into a conflict. Grolmann, he saw the defense of the city as futile. Furthermore, he did not want the water reservoirs as well as the electricity supplies to be damaged, which would have disastrous consequences for the population of Leipzig. So he wanted to surrender. Poncet, on the other hand, he was decorated for gallantry during the war, and he didn't want to end his career like this. Think of it, I mean, your whole country is in ruins. people die every day and you're thinking of your career. So he withdrew into the City Hall of Leipzig and several other buildings, as well as the big monument you see behind me. Now this monument is the Battle of the Nations monument, in German known as the Völkerschlachtdenkmal, which was a monument built in 1913 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Leipzig against Napoleon. And take a look at the structure of this massive building, because this proved to be an ideal stronghold. So Grolmann, he sent out an officer to the nearest Americans he could find. It was a German officer that reached the American lines and got into touch with an American captain, Charles B. MacDonald. He was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge and the Hurricane Force and would later become a famous author. MacDonald was kind of baffled that this German officer was willing to surrender the city to just a captain, but a captain was good enough. So MacDonald, he joined the German and went to the headquarters of Grolmann, and there he found the German officers in their neatly pressed uniforms, while he himself was wearing a filthy uniform and had a scruffy beard. Now Grolmann said he was willing to surrender the city, but he also made clear that he had no control over Poncet and his troops. And Grolmann's effort might have been noble, but by that time, fighting had already begun in the city of Leipzig, and thus the Battle of Leipzig had kicked off. American troops, they entered Leipzig on April 18th, and behind barricades and overturned cars, there were Volkssturm members and Wehrmacht troops firing upon them. They were quickly taken out. But when the Americans entered Napoleon Square, they were greeted by a hail of bullets and Panzerfaust rounds. One American tank was taken out and they suffered some casualties. Near the city hall, things weren't great either. An American tank with soldiers on top of it was hit severely, and the soldiers were blown off the tank by German fire. This was due to faulty maps. The following morning, the Americans did another attempt to seize the area, but this failed. The defenders were holding up in the city hall. So now the Leipziger chief of the fire department was sent in to inform the defenders that if they would not surrender, the building would come under fire by heavy artillery. After this, 200 Germans walked out with their hands in the air. Others, like the city treasurer, committed suicide. Meanwhile, Poncet was holding out with his men in the building you see right there, and this here served as a true bastion. Now, what made things worse was that he was holding 17 American POWs, so the Americans couldn't really use flamethrowers because they would incinerate their own men. An American captain, his name was Hans Trefousse, who had originally been born in Frankfurt, Germany, and now served as an interrogator of German prisoners, was sent in the building together with a German prisoner and Lieutenant Colonel George Knight. They approached the monument under a flag of truce. Now, once inside, Trefousse pointed out how hopeless the situation actually was. "If you were a Bolshevik," Poncet sneered, "I wouldn't talk to you at all. In 4 years, you and I will meet in Siberia." Trefousse, he said, "Well, if that is true, wouldn't it be a pity to sacrifice all these German soldiers who could help us against the Russians?" After an 11-hour argument, 11 hours, the Germans decided to surrender. The Battle of Leipzig was now over. Now, since the Americans wouldn't drive on Berlin, this was the last action they saw. A few months later, July 1945, the Soviets would relieve the Americans, because Leipzig was in East Germany and inside the Soviet sphere of influence, and would later become a prominent city in the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But that here is a story for another time. Okay, now look right here. You might be thinking, Hustler, you are in front of a monument that is dedicated to the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. Where's the video about that? Well, there isn't. But why? For that, I ask you to watch my Q&A. If you haven't seen that one yet, you'll learn about me personally if you're interested. And if you'd like to know more about the Volkssturm, you know, this last ditch German army, click right here. Thank you so much for watching. You can check me out on Patreon if you want to support me. Until next time.